Hello, and welcome back to part 3 of my continuing series on my stroke and stroke recovery. Today we're talking with my speech therapist, which is the wrong title. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And I want to say thank you to Renee for coming on this morning to talk to us about speech, cognition, and more. So thank you, Renee. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
Oh, it's nice to see you too, Renee. Now, I've mentioned you, as you saw in that schedule, as a speech therapist. It's not really your title. So the actual designation is SLP. What does that stand for? What does it mean? And how is that different from other therapists that I'm working with on a regular basis?
Great question. SLP stands for Speech Language Pathologist, and we are given that title because we are actually able to make diagnoses for certain conditions,
Okay.
which is a different distinction between PT and OT. So,
Okay, fantastic. And after a stroke like I had, what are speech therapy or speech pathology's goals? What are you seeking to achieve when you see me every day?
Yeah, so usually our first line of defense is to evaluate somebody's swallowing, chewing and swallowing skills. Not something that's maybe typically thought of for the first thing with a stroke, but certainly an area that can be impacted anywhere from a mild impact to a profound impact with people. So that is usually when speech is called in, when an order is given for us, that's usually our first go-to, just to make sure people are safe on their current diet, whether that's the liquid texture, solid texture, taking oral medications, any of the above.
And I mentioned taking swallow tests in an earlier video and how much I didn't like barium crackers. Yes. What are those risks exactly? What are you trying to identify? I mean, it's choking hazard, but what are you looking for as part of that speech testing?
Certainly. Yes, obviously we don't want anyone choking. Our primary goal is to keep people from what's called aspirating, meaning things going down into the lungs versus down into the belly, which is ideally where all the food and the drink should go. So we usually bring some different snacks with us, crackers being one of them to kind of represent a regular texture, something dry and crunchy. But we can start with pudding, applesauce, soft salads, work our way up from there. And then we also, people don't think about having trouble swallowing liquids, but many people do, just because of the sheer nature of them. They want to go real fast. So making sure that people are safe to consume liquids. Unfortunately, some people need them to be thickened to kind of slow the whole process down. Not ideal. Not something that people tend to enjoy. So that's obviously not our first go-to, but if it's needed for safety, then that's where we start.
Yes, I think during the swallow test, I really started to hate graham crackers just a little bit. But yes, I think working with you, I wound up concentrating more on drinking and not trying to speak immediately because I was aspirating a little bit. And speaking of that word, which I learned during this whole process, gave a whole new kind of patina to the word aspirational, which doesn't have the same base at all, but that's how my brain works. So there you go. Speaking of brains working, let's talk about cognition for a second, because one of the surprises that I really had, you hear you have speech therapy. I'm thinking we're going to work on enunciation. We're going to do kind of drills that you do in drama class or something like that. But why was I taking so many math tests with you and otherwise playing word games? What were we doing?
Yeah, so most of what my job is, at least in the setting that I work in currently, is dealing with cognition. So assessing a patient's wide range of skills, from attention, memory, general thinking, organization skills, problem solving, numerical reasoning, which is where the math comes in, as well as reading comprehension, writing, all of the language modalities as well. So it's a very comprehensive group of skills that we address and we try to assess pretty thoroughly and then parse out little things that help the person function better as a whole.
Yeah, that L is doing work. A lot of language stuff.
Yes.
But yes, also counting down in 12s or 7s are very weird things to see if you're paying attention. And speaking of cognition tests, I just recently took a battery of like an hours long test. How does that differ from the screens that you do in inpatient rehab at Chelsea? What are they looking for? And what exactly is executive function? Because I hear it a lot.
Yes, great question. So a cognitive screener is meant to be something that's quick, easy to administer, maybe takes 30 minutes or less usually. And it's basically a snapshot that looks at all of those skills that I just mentioned, kind of gives the clinician a little sense of how this person is functioning. And if there's areas that are kind of coming up as difficulty, then we might need to do further assessment and dive deeper into those areas. What you were referring to was a more formal, lengthy, very in-depth assessment that typically doesn't happen in an acute setting. That's usually a couple months post-discharge, just to really gauge how the brain is recovering, and if we're back to what we call your baseline, and if there is any additional areas that needed to be addressed further. They're just more highly sensitive tests than what our quick little screeners are that we do here in the hospital. As far as executive functioning goes, that I like to describe as our adulting skills, all the things that we have to do on a daily basis to plan, organize, problem solve. There's deduction, inferencing, all of those more high-level skills. A lot of it has to do with the frontal lobe here. That part of the brain is primarily involved with those skills. So,
now for that and other things, what if I'm already bad at them? Like, how do you tell if you don't have a baseline whether or not something's wrong after a stroke or anything else?
Great question. Something that I think that's a good point, that, throughout the course of someone's treatment, we're, continually gathering information, so to speak, whether that's interviewing you more extensively or members of your family to kind of get a sense of how you were functioning before. If certainly there's different levels of strength of cognition, I will say, for individuals. We all have our skill sets that we do better with than others. But, our goal is always to try to get someone functioning as close to, if not at, where they were before the stroke or brain injury occurred.
And for me, you were able to check out some of the earlier YouTube videos, right? I mean, we talked about that while we were in therapy. And, if you've got 1,000 hours of video on you, that's helpful, but, it's not a requirement.
No, definitely not. Most people don't have such a battery available to us as you did. But that's where, family input, loved ones, caregivers,
Oh, yes, you should have heard COUNSEL in therapy, folks. She was pitching the channel to everybody. It's like, this is my husband, check him out. It was a lot.
She was great. Mrs. Hoeg is great.
Now, what's one thing that you think folks might not know about your work that you think they should? Or in other words, what better questions should I have already asked by now?
Oh, I think you've hit on a couple of the big ones already. People hear the term speech therapist, which is what's on my name badge too. And they say, well, I talk just fine. I don't see why I need to work with you. And you can understand how people can be hesitant or perhaps a little resistant at times, because we unintentionally tend to bring up maybe skills that people aren't as comfortable with, or they know could potentially be an area that is just not as strong as other skill sets. And not everybody is receptive to receiving that feedback. So there's, a balance there and a tactful way to go about trying to help bring awareness to people. But yeah, the term speech therapist is a bit misleading at times, because what we do, the list of things we do is a mile long, which is one of the things that I absolutely love about my job, because it's not the same thing every day and it's not the same thing with every patient. So keeps it interesting.
Yeah, and that brings me to another question. Is that what made you become an SLP? Is that what brought you to it? Or what else, if there's something else, made you decide to want to become a speech therapist or speech language pathologist?
Yeah. So growing up, I always wanted to be a teacher. I loved school. I had a little classroom set up in my house. I take extra workbooks home from school if teachers were throwing things out. So that was where my brain was. That was where my track was heading. And when I was in high school, a friend of mine's mother was a speech therapist, and she said, hey, why don't you come job shadow with me for a day and check out special education? At the time, she worked with actually preschoolers, so very young children. Went and spent a day with her. I absolutely fell in love with the one-on-one work that she did. And, at the time, special education, it was much easier to find a job. So I kind of shifted gears and was headed in that direction. Another interesting thing about our field is there is the healthcare setting and then there is the education setting. All through college, I was dead set on an education track, thinking I would be working in the schools with kids. Of course, when I graduated, I was broke and needed a job and wound up in healthcare and haven't looked back since. It's been over 10 years and I have really I think I found my niche here, and I really enjoy working with the adult population. I think we do a lot of meaningful work in a short amount of time for people when they're going through this acute phase of a stroke, brain injury, whatever it may be. So it's very satisfying. And it's to me, I like getting people over that initial hump and then kind of get them set on their way for the rest of their recovery. So a little bit of a winding road there for me, but
it's a great answer. And yeah. I agree that I think you found a great niche, because I was nervous a lot when you would come to the room. More often than the other therapists, Renee would come to the room to do whatever testing she was doing and distract. And she played music to try to keep the mind going in different directions while we took tests and things like that. And it was fantastic. But it was nerve-wracking because you really never had any idea what was going to happen in SLP that day, because it's just so different from moment to moment. And we played a lot of games. We talked about that. But speaking of those, one of the ones that I played a lot with you and other therapists that I've gone along the road with are these kinds of free association type things, words that start with the letter F. Mm-hmm. I'm always trying to hold down my need to be clever or shocking. You all seem to love the letter F, so that seems to invite that. Can you remember any unusual answers that I gave while I was there, or the most unusual answers you ever heard? And do you have problems with folks that are trying to be too clever, not wanting to be vulgar, or otherwise getting blocked by something when you're trying to test for their mental cognition?
Oh, great question. I know that I learned a lot of legal words, jargon, not necessarily jargon, but legal vocabulary.
I might have thrown fiduciary at you. I don't know. Yeah.
During our time together, which is great. Speech therapists tend to like words. So to expand our lexicon is always, a good thing. Remembering working with you, you didn't go for the easy answers. You were always pushing yourself to think outside the box a little bit. And I think that speaks to you and your resilience and how far you've come. Not that there's anything wrong with taking the easy answer in the heat of the moment there, but
I used heart yesterday. So there you go.
But certainly, I think it's fascinating. My brain goes one way and somebody else's brain goes an entirely different direction. And I think that's one of the cool things about doing those different activities.
Well, I was a little worried about this particular interview, Renee, because I talked to Hallie, I talked to Laura already. Folks that have been watching the series have hopefully seen those interviews. They've gone up and there were no issues. But Hallie can't check out my legs and whether I can stand or balance while I'm on this video. And Laura can't check whether my hand is working properly or whether I'm typing or cheating or using my shoulder or torso or whatever. You are evaluating my speech right now, right? I mean, I'm not saying in a clinical setting, but you can see whether I'm talking and whether it's successful. And I'm sure you're looking at like the left side of my face and going, move that a little bit more, Rick, and that kind of thing. But do you find yourself in real life evaluating people that you just meet? You have all these kind of cognition tests and skills. What does that look like for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think as therapists in general, we always kind of have a different set of eyes going on. And for me, a different set of ear, listening to people. I try to have a bit of a separation of work and home life, but yeah, certainly there are things that kind of pop out that, make you go, about different things. Family is always kind of an interesting thing. They'll be like, well, what do you think about so-and-so? She's been repeating herself a lot lately, or, different questions like that. And it's, it can be awkward at times to try to informally assess, maybe your sister's mother-in-law or something along those lines. But
I can imagine.
Yeah. I think it's just something, we always have our ears and eyes open and are watching and listening for things, obviously being sensitive and appropriate at the same time. But there are definitely things that stand out. And I'm sure, speech therapists that work in the schools and they're listening to children speak, articulation is always, pops out at them. So.
Sure. No, good answer.
Yeah.
Now, finally here, I promised folks that we would keep these between 10 and 20 minutes. These are very busy people, a lot of people to help. I did want to thank you so much for everything you did for me and for being a good, positive force at Chelsea during that whole period. But for one last question, we talked a little bit about words and cleverness and ridiculousness. I've asked all of my therapists this as my final question. How did you put up with my nonsense for so long?
Oh gosh, there was no putting up with anything. You were certainly one of the highlights of my day while I got to spend the time with you. And you and I didn't even have a ton of time together because you were doing so well with everything that we were working on. But I feel like I learned just as much from you, hopefully, as maybe I was able to part some knowledge for you and your family. But you're such an inviting personality. It's not difficult to be around you one bit.
You all are way too nice.
I have your stickers in my office and at home on my refrigerator. So Hoeg Law is represented.
Yeah. You all are way too nice to me, but I appreciate it. And speaking of being nice, folks, for those of you that have seen the schedule before, I apologize, but I do want to tell folks again, we are having a fundraiser for the folks at Chelsea Hospital, like Renee, like Laura, like Hallie, and at Ascension Hospital that helped perform the surgery on my brain that helped save my life on May 6, 2023. So if you're interested in that, please do pop in. And Renee, thank you so much again for popping in with me this morning. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's my honor.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.